The Society for Vascular Surgery has decided to sponsor an audiovisual archive to focus on the individuals who have allowed vascular surgery to develop and become a recognized specialty. My name is Roger Gregory, and today I will be interviewing Dr. William Pearce. Bill, thank you for agreeing to this interview.
My pleasure.
Let's first talk about your early days. You were born when?
February 19th, 1949. I was born in Colorado in a small town named Pueblo, which is south of Colorado Springs.
Is that a big town or?
No, it's a small town. It was a small town then, a small town now. It's not gotten any bigger.
Tell me about your parents.
Well, my dad really did, he worked for a National Cash Register and did a lot of repair of small business machines, and he did building of houses and construction work, so I learned at a very early age how to hammer and saw and nail. And my mom worked for a set of doctors in Colorado Springs, so I had this exposure to doctors at the same time. So based on that family history, I should be an orthopod more than anything, rather than a vascular
When you
surgeon.
say she worked for doctors, was she a nurse or
She was a
worked in
receptionist.
office receptionist?
Yeah, the lady at the front door, and she did the billing and things like that.
Probably the most important, two most important parts of a practice.
Yeah, true today.
Now, where did you go for grade school?
Well, I did almost all of my education in that one spot in Colorado. So it sits at the foothills of Cheyenne Mountain. So if you've ever been in Colorado Springs, there's a mountain that sits right behind it. And there's a little grade school and a high school that sit right there. And if you've ever been to the Broadmoor Hotel, that grade school is right next to that hotel. So it's a really pretty location. There's a mountain. We lived on the side of a mountain, basically, and I rode my bike down the mountain to school, and then coming home was the problem. You had to go back up the mountain.
Now, high school, in the same general location?
Yeah, same thing. The high school was named Cheyenne Mountain High School, and that's the mountain we lived on, so it sat right at the base of that same mountain.
Now, this was a public school?
Public school.
What were you thinking about then?
What most high school kids think about.
besides chasing girls, what did you want to be?
Well, probably an architect more than anything, and that period of time was the 60s. You know, it was 65, 66, 67, and in Colorado and probably most of the country, that was right in the middle of the hippie movement, and it was an interesting time to grow up and be in Colorado at the time, because there was so much social upheaval, not only there but on both sides of the coast. So it was really very interesting time in the 60s.
So you played some tennis in high school?
I did. The way I paid my way through college was to teach at a country club and teach at the high school. So I would give summer lessons and make my money to go to college for the rest of the year. And I did that all the way through medical school. So into my second year of medical school, I would teach at country clubs or sometimes hotels, mostly country clubs.
Who's your favorite player?
Well, at the time it was probably Rod Laver. You know, he was a big left-handed guy, an Aussie.
Wait a minute, you're not lefty.
No, I'm a right-handed.
Okay, good.
But he was the favorite. And maybe John Newcomb, he was another one about that time.
Super. All of a sudden, this guy who's from Pueblo goes to Harvard? What's that about, Bill?
Well, I'm not sure why I wound up there. I applied to a lot of colleges and got into most of them. And I got into Stanford and to Yale and Harvard, and it turned out Harvard had the best scholarship for me. And so, so I just took it based on money. And I'd never been to the East Coast. I'd just been in Colorado all my life. And my favorite story about going back to Harvard is that I got off the airplane and they had a funny accent, first of all. And second of all,
I would say so.
And second of all, I asked them to take me to my dorm, and my dorm was called Wigglesworth. That was the name of the dorm. And so I had this cabbie with a heavy Boston accent saying, "Are you kidding me? We're going to Wigglesworth?" but that was probably my longest cab ride ever. I was trying to find Wigglesworth. And that's, so I went, it was interesting to be a Westerner at that time, never been to the East Coast, going there as a freshman. And again, it was in the 60s. Again, there was a lot of social upheavals. The East Coast in Boston was full of colleges, and there was lots of social unrest.
So this was kind of a, would you say, a culture shock for you going there?
Yes.
Is that a mild
That's a
thing?
modest thing. It was a culture shock for sure.
Did you felt like you fit in there?
You did after a while. My roommates were from like Andover and Exeter, those big East Coast private schools, and they accepted you, and we had a lot of fun.
You majored in biology at that
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
When did you consider going to medical school?
Probably in the freshman year. My freshman year.
Because
Well, during high school, we had close friends. One was a pathologist, and we did science fair projects in high school and those sort of things on science. I was interested in it pretty early on. So one close family friend was a pathologist, and he would help me on different projects if I had got interested in it.
finally you did go to medical school, 1971 to 75, University of Colorado. Now we're back in Colorado, this time in Denver.
Correct. Well, there's two good reasons for that. One, my tuition was $1,000 a year. I was still paying to get my way through college, and my summer tennis lessons would help go a long ways in paying that $1,000 tuition for in-state. And I met my wife, Ann, who I'd gone to high school with. And we got married in our second year there. So a lot of reasons to go back to Colorado.
When did you decide to focus on surgery?
Well, the University of Colorado was a pretty interesting place at the time. Tom Starzl was our chairman, and he was of the Department of Surgery, and he was a very engaging man.
Yes.
And he was the father of liver transplants, and so there was a lot of excitement about liver transplants. He did a lot of dog surgery, a lot of experimental surgery. And I'd gone through that, and actually I wanted to be an internist, and I went to the Mayo Clinic as a resident in internal medicine. But it was after about 6 months of being at the Mayo Clinic that I said this was the wrong course. And so they took me back as an intern in surgery the following year. So I did actually 2 internships. I did one in surgery and one in medicine.
Was your experience at Mayo enlightening, or was this a bad experience, or wasted time, or?
No, it was a good time. It was, when I thought about it in retrospect, you know, if you did a year of surgery and went into medicine, that would be probably a waste of time. But if you did a year of medicine, you had your fundamentals, and then you went into surgery, you're sort of ahead of the game.
Let's drop back to when you got married now. This was during your time in medical school?
Correct, my second year.
And you and Ann have several children now.
We do. After we were married. No,
Is this?
Just kidding you. Sorry, guys.
Are they grown now, Bill? Or?
I have 4 children, and we had our first 2 boys in medical, not medical school, but residency. So Billy and Charlie were married our second year in residency, which was hard. And for my wife, we were on call every other night. It was like most of the residencies at that time, total immersion, no work hours. So it was every other night, every other weekend. Usually went to the hospital about 6 and got home at 10 on the days off. And then you just stay in the hospital. So we had 2 children during residency, and then 2 much later. And now I have 5 grandchildren. So it's been
Maybe that was a good move early on.
I think so.
Your surgery residency after the internship at Mayo was back in University of Colorado with Tom Starzl as the chairman.
That's correct.
But yet, you decided to do a fellowship in vascular surgery, not transplant. Or was you thinking about transplantation?
No, I remember doing cases with Dr. Starzl and holding retractors, and he had fellows in transplant, and those were very long cases. And liver transplants in the late 70s usually took about 20 hours, 24 hours, and maybe 100 units of blood. They were very difficult operations, and the immunotherapy that we have today wasn't the same. The poor patients were really sick afterwards, and it was a very, not demanding, but almost depressing specialty. And I like the technical aspects of the liver transplants, kidney transplants, and I also like cardiac surgery. So up until probably my chief residency, I was planning to do cardiac surgery. But the cardiac surgery attendings at that time, their lifestyle was even worse than mine as a resident. They just literally never went home. I at least got to go home at 10 o'clock at night. They had a terrible lifestyle. So in my 5th year, because I liked the technical aspects of it, I started to think about vascular surgery. And Bob Rutherford was the division chief at the University of Colorado. And I remember doing a case with Bob of a young girl that had a dog bite to the arm that had lacerated her brachial artery. And it was such a nice operation, so gratifying, and the little girl did well that there was really no going back after I did that case with Bob.
So, how did you, the NAIA, get interested in Northwestern?
Well, so what happened was that I took another rotation back at the Mayo Clinic to work with a man named Bob Beard, who was a colorectal surgeon that was working on Coke pouches, and he was actually a resident of Colorado that I had known. So I went back to the Mayo Clinic, was doing Coke pouches with him, and that really solidified the fact I didn't want to do colorectal. And so I called Bob Rutherford and I said, I really want to go into vascular. And I think he made phone calls to his friends in the country, one of them being John Bergen and Jimmy Yao. And I came back to Denver after this sort of 3-month rotation at the Mayo Clinic, and John had flown out to a meeting, John Bergen had flown out to a meeting in Denver to give a talk at a meeting that Bob was having. And Dr. Bergen interviewed me, and he sort of did it on the fly. He had forgotten his shirt and had to go to a store to buy a shirt. So he and I walked through a department store to find him a shirt so he could talk at this meeting. And that was my interview. And then within a few weeks or so, I'd gotten the job at Northwestern. And then when I finished my chief residency, I came to Northwestern.
At that time, it was a 1-year fellowship?
It was, and I'd never been in Chicago again. It's one of those, you know, Westerners going east, and I'd never been in Chicago.
Was this another culture shock for Bill Pearce?
It was another culture shock.
And when you finished practice, it looks like you still wanted to travel. In 1982, you went to Cincinnati with the famous Dick Kimzinski.
That's correct.
What was that?
Well,
What was that about?
So what had happened to Colorado was Dr. Starzl had left Colorado. And the original plan was that when I finished my fellowship, I would go back and work with Bob at Colorado and be a vascular surgeon with him. Dr. Starzl left and gone to Pittsburgh, and that left a void at the leadership, and so there was no guarantee for a job when I got back. And so Bob couldn't offer me a job until they had gotten a new chairman. Dick Kimzinski was actually a faculty member at Colorado when I was a resident. And with Dr. Starzl leaving, many of the faculty, or at least 2 of the really important faculty members, went to Cincinnati with Joe Fisher. So when I finished my fellowship, the job in Colorado was up in the air, so Dick said, you know, come work with me at the University of Cincinnati.
After 2 years there, though, you returned to Denver.
That's right. And the reason for that was that the chairmanship job had sort of settled down in Denver. We had, by that time, 3 children, and my wife was a little homesick and in need of some support from her family, and I, you know, thought it was important too. And I'd always wanted to go back to Colorado, so I felt a little bit bad leaving Dick, but I went back to the University of Colorado for 4 years in Colorado.
Right, and rose to associate professor.
Correct.
In comes Jimmy Yao
Correct.
in 1988 and convinced you to come back to Chicago.
Correct.
Now, what did your family think about that?
Well, that's another good story. About the time, the University of Colorado is a state institution, so it had limits on how much money could be spent. So, for example, if you wanted to buy an ultrasound machine, you had to go to the state legislature to get approval for this machine. The state of Colorado at the time was having trouble because that was the first of the oil busts. So the oil prices went down, and Denver sort of had a very hard time economically. And the university was struggling, and I really couldn't get things accomplished very well, and I was thinking about moving. And Jimmy had heard about that. John Bergen was had left
Right.
Northwestern at the time. So Jimmy asked me to come out, and we came out on several occasions. And at the last meeting I had with Jimmy, he asked me to come down and have breakfast with him, and discuss it. And by that time, Ann and I had thought, we're not going to come to Chicago. And she had called her mom and said, we're not going to Chicago, we're staying in Colorado so we can raise the kids, we've decided that. So I went down and had breakfast with Jimmy, and by the time my wife came down there, I had accepted the job. So she was quite surprised when Jimmy had hugged her and said, "Congratulations, you're coming to Chicago." And my wife's look at me was, what happened?
Well, Jimmy Out, as you and I both know, is a very convincing guy.
Correct.
By 1993, you were full professor, and then in 1998, you became chief of vascular surgery and the program director at Northwestern. That's tremendous movement.
Thanks.
Tremendous progress.
I had a good mentor with Jimmy.
Meanwhile, there were some other activities that Bill Pearce was involved in. Going to Walter Reed in 2006 and 2007, Germany 2008 and 9, again in 2011 and 12. Not associated with the military. You weren't in the military at that time. What was that all about, Bill?
Well, along 2000, the first time when I went to Walter Reed, I think all of us as surgeons have a period in our life when we sort of lack something. You've done the academics, you've done the clinical work, but you feel like you need to give back. And so that was my feeling at the time, and I think most surgeons reach that. At some point in their life, they want to give back. And if you think about it, what can a vascular surgeon do? And that's really stop blood or recorrect blood flow. You could either stop hemorrhaging or you can do revascularization. So I thought long and hard about it. The Iraq War was probably in one of its peak periods at the time. And I had first called Norm Rich about it because Norm was running USIS at the time. And he referred me to a fellow named Dave Gillespie. So I called up David Gillespie, who was the division chief at Walter Reed, and I said, is there anything I can do to help the war effort? I feel bad for these young men who are the ages of my children. What can I do to help? And he said, well, most of the vascular surgeons are now deployed. We have nobody here in Walter Reed. I have to go through a program review. I could really use somebody's temporary help for a couple of weeks.
Wow.
So I said, sure. And it wasn't really a bad deployment for me because a friend of mine had membership to the Chevy Chase Country Club, and that's where I stayed for 2 weeks. And I commuted over to the Walter Reed and did cases, and most of the cases were elective vascular surgery. And from that experience, I told David, I'd sort of like to get closer to the front, to get closer to the action, get closer, to Iraq.
Right.
And so I went back to Norm Rich, and it turns out that another friend of mine, Gene Moore, who's a trauma surgeon in Denver General in Colorado, who's well known in the general surgery world, had established a program of rotations of trauma surgeons into Landstuhl. So modeling after that, I went back to Dave Gillespie and say, let me go to Landstuhl, because these other guys are going, so let me go. So he started a program of rotations into Landstuhl, which is the German, large U.S. Hospital in Germany that all of the injured Iraqi soldiers, Afghan soldiers go there first before they come back to the United States. Okay. So they established this rotation for 2 weeks, and now it goes on. Anybody can go now. So they have a rotation schedule. So
This is a good experience?
It was a wonderful experience, yes. Really
what did you do?
Well, the first time that I was there, you did a lot of washouts for the IEDs, the traumatic injuries, mostly that. There was an occasional revascularization, but most of the injuries are non-reconstructables because they're mostly blast injuries. And I asked one of the commandants when I was there, I said, I don't feel like I did a whole lot. And he said, well, it's really your gray hair. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, it's you have to give the younger surgeons a little bit of courage to take a leg off or to take an arm off because they want to keep trying to save it, and you have the experience to say, no, that's not it. So the useful part of it was being the gray-haired guy in the room.
Bill, you've been involved also in a lot of church activities. This is unrelated to your experience, say, in Germany or at Walter Reed.
Well, some. I mean, it's not as, my wife does a whole lot more than I do. I just do soup kitchens and things like that.
In Chicago?
Yes.
When did you feel that, or do you feel that the underserved needs to be addressed by vascular surgeons or the medical community in general?
In my presidential address for the societies, I had a little section on the high rate of amputations in minority populations.
Right.
So we're in Chicago today, and we're down near Michigan Avenue for this interview, and if you just drive 10 miles that direction, you'll get into really a wasteland of healthcare. And it's the socioeconomics, it's multifactorial. You know, when I first started doing this stuff, I thought, well, that's low-hanging fruit. You know, I do stem cells, I do stents, I do revascularizations, I do all this really very high-end work. But if I were just to go a few miles away and just do the fundamentals, I could save a lot more limbs than what I do here at Northwestern. But as it turns out, that's a pretty complicated system, and it's not quite so easy to fix as I thought.
Right. Right. But still worth the effort.
Oh, it's worth the effort by far, because the amputation rate 5 miles from here is 5 times what it is where I live up in the north side of Chicago.
Yikes.
It's way different.
Bill, when you came back to Northwestern, you were charged with involvement in research. Somehow, you were able to bridge the gap between basic surgeons and clinicians. How did you do that? Because that, I can tell you from my own personal experience, that's not easy. How did you do that?
Well, I think John Manick came here as a visiting professor once, and he said, you know, if you have your mind in the lab, that's what's important. So you could be doing a case and have your mind in the lab trying to understand the biology of it. And I remember as a surgery resident, you'd take out a cancer of a liver or cancer of a small bowel, and you had this tumor in your hand, and you just were trying to understand how could that all go so wrong. So when I became a vascular surgeon, you have an aneurysm in your hand, and those same questions were there. You looked down and you saw this pathology, and you said, you know, your body's a fabulous, you know, biologic system, and what in the world went wrong to make this aneurysm occur? So I think that's what probably the next generation of vascular surgeons are going to miss, because all they're going to do is see an image, and they're not going to really feel the pathology sitting in their hand saying, man, what is doing this?
This is impressive. The molecular biology and research that you were involved in, you were also able to coordinate your efforts with basic scientists, PhDs such as Rex Chisholm, able to write papers with basic scientists. This is impressive. How were you able to do that?
Well, I think if they sense your sincerity, they respond in an equal kind way. So Rex was a fortunate collaborator. When I came here as a young attending, I asked one of the medical students, I said, who's the single best basic scientist around? And they said, Rex Chisholm. So I just knocked on his door and said, you know, Rex, I'm Bill Pearce. These are my interests. And, you know, and he was welcoming enough, and we had a great run together.
The other areas of interest besides aneurysms was endothelial lining of grafts. How did that work out?
Well, that was really the early start. You
right.
know, historically, that's how vascular surgeons got into biology. You could look at different camps. You know, Alex Clues was doing hyperplasia. John Maddox was doing a lot of white cell work. Dave Tilson was doing aneurysm. And then there was Jim Stanley and Malcolm Herring. Those folks were doing endothelial cells. And that biology was one that we could all learn pretty easily. And once you broke that sort of barrier, then you could do the more sophisticated biology. It's sort of like I think of it in the endovascular world. once vascular surgeons could sort of break that barrier that they could put a catheter in things, they could do just about anything. So it's just breaking that barrier.
And you had some other non-vascular interests, if you will. Trauma, wound care. And also in the middle of all this, you were able to get critical care boards. Is this something vascular surgeons should do?
Well, this goes back a long time ago. Again, things have changed a lot. So when I was the president of the ISCVS, the American Association of Vascular Surgery, we tried to define what a vascular surgeon was. And
Right.
There was 5 pillars.
Right.
There was the non-invasive, the vascular medicine, the vascular surgery, the endo, and the critical care. And in those days, the critical care divisions and the ICUs were open. And so and we all felt very strongly at the time that once you did an operation on a patient, you should be able to care for them throughout their course.
Right.
So once you did an aneurysm on them, they went to the unit, you should measure you should be able to take care of their ventilators, their dribs, their sepsis, whatever it was. And you didn't want to turn it over to an intensivist. And that was a prevailing feeling for 4 or 5, 6 years there. But as surgeons got busier and most units had then switched by that time over to just closed units where an intensivist ran the whole thing. So modern vascular surgeons don't do as much in critical care as they used to. It's probably not as important either in the current
You agree with
world.
that?
I think so.
Somewhere in here, multiple people termed you a team player, which I think is quite a compliment. The lady that ran the OR, Carol, what was her last name?
Cox,
And Carol Algren,
same one. That's her.
and Vicky
Correct. Fahey.
Fahey was a hospital nurse, all seemed to think you were a team player. Do you think that's important for a vascular surgeon?
It is, and I think it was really what Jimmy and John had started at Northwestern. And the original model that we all worked in, and it's changed, unfortunately, was that we came to work, there was a set amount of work to do. Whether I did it, or John did it, or Bill Flynn, or Jimmy Yao did it, the work got done. And that's sort of changed. And that was true with Vicky and with Carol. And the reason we succeeded was we worked all together for the benefit of the patient, of course, and it just worked. There was no one person trying to take a lead over another person. We just all pushed straight ahead.
Changing gears a little bit, in Norfolk, when we were interviewing candidates for the vascular surgery fellowship, one of the things that we always looked for was an outstanding performance at every level prior to the fellowship level. In our mind, this was an indication of a future star. Looking at your CV, that is exactly what you've demonstrated.
That's kind to say.
In college, at Harvard no less, you were cum laude, medical school AOA, multiple teaching awards wherever you went. You even got the Martin Luther King Jr. Award. Some 238 publications, 34 books, 114 chapters, president of the prestigious American Association of Vascular Surgeons, Colorado Trauma Care Research Institute, multiple editorial boards. You were invited to lecture all over the country and even the world. In the face of this, you were able to amass massive research grants. Recognize all these impressive achievements and enormous success. Were you ever disappointed?
Oh, I think there's not a day goes by you're not disappointed about something. Whether you could have done the operation better, you could have written a grant better, you could have been a better father, you could have been a better this. There's not a day that goes by you don't have some disappointment.
How did you respond to that? How did you face what you may have seen as failures?
Well, there's lots of ways you do that. Spiritually, you do it. Sometimes you put your head down and you work just harder. Sometimes you just dismiss it, whatever the problem
Have
is.
to move on.
Yeah, just got to keep going.
And yet, after all these honors and recognition in undergraduate school, graduate school, postgraduate training, yet you then excel further. How do you see yourself as being so different, Bill?
Well, I'm probably not a whole lot different, but it's one of those things where early struggles are important, and if you have everything given to you, it's not the same as having to work and achieve it. And so once you experience that early on, it's really very beneficial. And I tease my residents today. I say, you know, the recent generation of kids that got trophies, even if they lost, that is not right. You have to lose occasionally to become a winner. And there was an editorial, and I think it's really quite true. It's called grit. It's when you fail, you get back up and keep going. So grit is really important. Even though you have adversity, that you can figure out a way to get around it.
And I think this is important, that even our heroes in vascular surgery face failure. Things don't always work out. They're not the magician they think they are sometimes. And this is sometimes hard to handle.
That's true.
But very, very necessary and important. Now let's get down to some serious topics. Tennis. You started in high school. Now, you, like all the rest of us amateur tennis players, you've had some injuries. Are you playing back now?
No, I'm just starting back after I tore an Achilles tendon. I forgot to tell you that one of the reasons Jimmy hired me to come back was to be a fourth in his doubles, because one of his fellows had sort of gone on a different direction, so he knew I played tennis and he needed a fourth.
Now, you mentioned too that your dad kind of led you about in the way of carpentry, and you keep on with that even though you're not an orthopod.
Correct.
What kind of carpentry are you doing? Inside, outside?
Well, anytime I have the opportunity, I'm usually knocking a wall down or plastering or nailing, or I had to give up my power tools because I was a little worried about cutting my fingers off. So I use sort of the old carpenter saw. I use drills, power drills, things like that, but I don't use the power saws like I used to.
Do these things that you do, like taking out walls, did they work out okay? Or?
Well, the good thing about it is that you can always fix it. It's not like when you're doing surgery. You can always go to the hardware store and get a new part or a new piece. So one of my best friends in the city I live in is my hardware store guy. And I've actually had to go to the hospital with him a couple of times. He had a stroke, so he and I've become quite close. And actually his son had a liver transplant, so it's a very small world.
Somewhere in here you got interested in automotive mechanics. What is this about a Triumph TR3?
Well, it's probably that culture of not having a lot of money. So all of my early cars that I owned were $500 cars. They all cost $200 to $500. Most of them were British sports cars, because they were the cheapest and they also demanded the most work. Mm-hmm. So in medical school I had a TR4 that died, and so I didn't have the money to buy a new car, so it was small enough that you could easily take it apart, and you could get the engine out of the car without a lot of difficulty. Those things were like big lawnmowers, really. So the carburetors were all easy to fix. So
you got them to work?
Got it to work. So once you had that experience of taking something apart and putting it back and it worked, then you became fearless. You could take anything apart.
Is that when the GTO Pontiac came up?
Yeah, we had a GTO Pontiac for a while. That car was useful because my children, that had a very large engine in it. It was through the 60s, and my kids would sit in the front seat, and if you would accelerate rapidly, they'd flip over into the back seat, and they thought it was just the best of times.
Do you still have the GTO?
No, I sold it, unfortunately.
What are you driving now?
A Ford truck. Correct.
Made in Norfolk, I hope. Now, another area that I'd like to discuss that is a fascinating area for me, and that is time management. Bill, you were able to do all of these things academically, research, clinical, publication. What are your secrets in time management, and how do you avoid being overcommitted?
Well, my secretary said it was a good thing I wasn't a teenage girl, because I could never say no. So that was her motto to me, was just say no. But I was never good at time management. And Gene Moore, who was one of my close friends, said the only time that somebody doesn't miss you is like 5 o'clock in the morning. So that's the time you usually would get your work done, is those 5 to 7, real early in the morning, because in the evening was family.
Yeah.
And so that would be it. And I would often tease my residents that my academic time was when I rode the elevators from floor to floor to go to see patients. So I do my academic work on the way. But it's remarkable because I was also associated with good people, and those good people are just invaluable because you can't do it alone. So I had fellows, and I had good partners, and I had Vicki and Carol. So that, that it all made it work.
Bill, who do you see as your mentors?
You have different mentors for different things. You have good mentors and you have bad mentors too.
Who are your good mentors?
Well, I would probably put Jimmy at the top, followed by John, and then and Bob Rutherford and Dick. I mean, all of them, there's a little piece that you would take from each of them. There's always a little something you learn from all of them.
Did you have mentors that were not particularly helpful or gave you directions you didn't want to go in?
Well, I'm not sure if you call them mentors or not, but you could see surgeons who acted out in the operating room that treated people poorly, which wasn't the right thing to do.
No.
So that's sort of, they're not really mentors, they're just negative influences. There's other people that were terrible with their patients. There's other people that looked at themselves as the supreme being on the division, and nobody else existed, and you knew that wasn't it. So there's a lot of different things. But as far as mentors, it'd be Jimmy and John and Bob, and maybe Dick Kandinsky a little bit too.
A final round of questions I want your opinion on. The first is the merger of SVS and ISCVS. Do you think this has harmed international exchange?
Well, not at all. I think several physicians, other vascular surgeons, tried to establish an international society to replace the old ISCVS. But I think the SVS has done a terrific job in being inclusive of international folks. It's not often on each coast, so it's difficult for the international people to come to the meeting. But when it's on a coast, say in Boston or Washington, you get a lot of international people. And if you look at the JVS has a large international contribution. So I think the SVS has done a good job in making that outreach.
What was your early view of endovascular surgery? Did you think it was crazy, or did you think it was good, or?
Well, that's another good story. Jimmy and I had Juan Perotti come to the Northwestern Symposium in 1991. And we were early embracers of that idea because he presented at our meeting. And Jimmy and I traveled to Utah to put endovascular grafts in cows.
Yes.
In 1992, maybe. And that was a great thing because we were on some airplane going from California to Utah, and I'm not sure the plane was ever going to make it there because it was like a very poor quality plane. And we get there, and if you can only imagine a cow on an operating table with its legs pointed straight up, sound asleep. And they give you a catheter and say, go put that catheter in this cow, and the cow doesn't smell particularly good. And it has a great blood pressure too. So it was, just picture that in your mind. 4 legs pointed straight up in the sky, and you have to go put an endograph in it. It was an experience. So we learned that, and that's probably 1991 or 92. And we came back and put our first endograph in 1993, and that was the first in Chicago and probably the first of a few in the country. And I think we put probably the 9th bifurcated endograph, the old Ancure, in the world. So we were very early adapters of it. And
you just looked at it and said, hey, this is going to work?
No, but it was a novel idea, and you knew that the open operation had a significant morbidity to it, and that if on the chance this technology was going to work, we better adapt it or we would be out of the game. We'd be replaced by cardiologists or interventional radiologists. So if we weren't early adapters and early evaluators of us, vascular surgery would not exist. And I sort of remember, and I read Jack Wiley's presidential address, he said that at his point in time, which was in the 70s, all of the knowledge about vascular disease had moved over to the vascular surgeon, and the whole body of knowledge around vascular disease was in vascular surgeons. Well, you could extrapolate that to the fact if endovascular worked, that whole body of knowledge would move out of vascular surgery and be dispersed among all these disciplines, and vascular surgery would sort of wither on the vine. So you had to be an early adapter. You know, some people say you don't want to be the first on the bandwagon or the last on the bandwagon. In this case, I think it was early to be an early adapter and figure out if it worked.
Right.
As you know, there was a move for development of an independent board of vascular surgery. Many of us pushed hard for this to happen. Furthermore, the majority of the SVS membership voted in favor of independence, and yet it failed. Why?
Well, that's a complex question, and there's the viewpoint that I'll provide you with was in the context of the time was that same time of endovascular revolution. And so as I looked at the situation is that what the vascular surgeons had to do was to retrain their workforce and adapt to this new technology or die. And if you distracted yourself by trying to establish a board, which I felt was not achievable for a variety of reasons, we'd be wasting money and time. Well, the goal was really to keep vascular as a whole. And as it turns out, though, the American Board of Vascular Surgery performed a very important function. And what it did was drive the American Board of Surgery to have what was initially called a sub-board, which today is called the Vascular Board. And that movement that was led by Jim Stanley and Ramon Berger and Bob Hobson and others really forced those folks into adapting our current state. So I give them a tremendous amount of credit, but at the same time, it was going to be a futile cause because Dave Narwhal, who was our chairman at the time, was also a part of the American Board of Surgery. And the American Board of Vascular Surgery couldn't exist without approval from the ABMS. And that was going to take lots and lots of money. And our society, even though it had a lot of money, really had to put that money to fend off interventional radiologists and cardiologists who would have taken away our signature operations, which was carotid stenting, leg bypasses, and aneurysms.
All right, that's a good answer. Bill, needless to say, American medicine and medical care has become a political football. Do you think we've lost our way?
I think that there's a book called The Social Transformation of Medicine, which follows how medicine has evolved over the last century. And it really stops probably around the time Medicaid was passed, Medicare was passed by Johnson. And that process has really accelerated since the 60s when Medicare was passed to a far worse condition. Right now you see hospitals really controlling all of our functions. Physicians play less and less role in the direction of medicine, and it is more and more controlled by not necessarily politicians, but really non-practicing clinicians, people that don't deal with patients anymore. So I think they really are missing the integral part of what a doctor is, and that's the doctor-patient relationship. And if you look at our own practice, it's really so regulated now by we call them suits. The suits are the administrators, and the suits can be different types of suits. So it can be the hospital administrator, the people in the C-suites, the CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and it can be the physicians, whether it's the dean, it's the chairman, whoever it is, they have us making RVUs, they follow us, ad nauseum versus our productivity and our metrics, the new word metrics and how they measure our function. So it's not as much fun because it's so highly not regulated, but highly monitored system.
This sounds a little bit pessimistic. Bill, do you think there is a way that we can retrieve our own goals and the goals of vascular surgery and medical care in the United States?
Well, I think the pendulum will switch backwards again. But I don't know when it's going to happen, and I often wonder because I'm getting close to Medicare age right now. But if Medicare was cut 20% as the doctor fixed bill, it doesn't go through, we all get to cut 20%. So a lot of physicians aren't going to take Medicare. So I think what's going to happen is physicians such as myself that are Medicare age will start taking care of themselves. Because I think the younger doctors aren't going to exclude us from their practices because our insurance, Medicare, won't pay them much. So I think we'll wind up caring for ourselves.
Final question. Do you have advice for young surgeons coming out today?
Young vascular surgeons?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's, when I came out, 30 years ago, it was a pretty fascinating open field, particularly the biology. And a lot of people were talking about the biology of vascular disease, and I think there's still a huge gap. And I think just getting people excited about our field, whether it's a student or a resident, I always like to be able to take a student or resident who's got their mind made up they're not going to be surgeons and make them into surgeons. That's my life's goal. So it's sort of fun when you see people come and they're so anti-surgery, so anti-this, and you just show them your world and they fall in love with it. So it's still very exciting, still wide open. Vascular disease is far from cured. It's a degenerative disease, it's a multifactorial disease, it's got many keys to it, and we're far from solving it. So, I mean, for someone to come out in this world, I think there's a lot they can do to change it.
Everybody I've talked to about Bill Pearce says one consistent thing: modest. Now, how can you be a vascular surgeon and still be modest? My final comment, Bill, is that I think you're the embodiment of the fact that nice guys don't always finish last.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for this interview.
Thanks.
At the 2019 annual meeting, Dr. Pearce received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the SVS for his constant dedication and service in so many areas of vascular surgery over so many decades.